Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, live on Channels Television. I'm Ladi Akiridoluale. The headlines. US $40 billion aid package for Ukraine hits a speed bump. Russia slams allegations of violence against children in Ukraine. And White House vows to support any move by Finland and Sweden to join NATO. A U.S. plan to provide nearly $40 billion in additional military and economic aid to Ukraine amidst its conflict with Russia has hit a speed bump, with Senator Rand Paul, a Republican from Kentucky, blocking a quick vote to approve the funding bill and likely delaying passage to at least next week. Senator Paul stood in the way by objecting to a request by Senate leaders to approve unanimous consent, a provision that allows bills with strong bipartisan support to be fast-tracked without debate. The former presidential candidate said he would only allow for a quick vote if the bill was revised to include the appointment of a special inspector general to monitor how the massive aid package is spent, a demand that Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer refused to meet. Senator Schumer claims that Washington had a moral obligation to help Ukraine in its fight against Russian President Vladimir Putin's, quote, immoral war. He said Mr. Paul's oversight provision was strongly opposed by Democrats and Republicans alike. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has released a statement criticizing Russia for targeting schools and healthcare facilities. According to him, over the course of hostilities since February the 24th, Russian troops have destroyed 570 healthcare facilities. 101 hospitals have been completely destroyed. This is stupidity. This is barbarism. He also spoke about Russian attacks in Chernihiv and the city of Kremenchuk, saying that Russia had suffered a tactical defeat but wouldn't admit it to themselves. He says, quote, Russia's strategic defeat is already obvious to everyone in the world and even to those who still communicate with them. Russia just doesn't have the courage to admit it yet. They're cowards and they try to hide the truth behind missile, air, and artillery strikes. Russia faced a further setback on the battlefield as Ukraine drove its troops out of the region around the second largest city, Kharkiv, the fastest advance since forcing the Kremlin's forces from Kiev and the northeast more than a month ago. Russia's ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, says the allegations of assorted atrocities against children purportedly committed by the Russian military in Ukraine are, quote, absurd and not backed up by any facts. The diplomat made the remarks during a UN Security Council meeting. She said, quote, today we once again heard accusations from a number of colleagues against the Russian military of committing acts of violence, including sexual violence against children. This was particularly voiced by a British colleague, by others as well, and these allegations are absurd. She added that the claims are not backed by facts, even with top Kiev officials admitting that they do not have actual evidence to support them, bringing up a recent interview with Daria Gremysimchuk, the advisor to Ukrainian President's Commissioner for Children's Rights. She countered that Ukrainian forces, on the contrary, have been routinely taking up positions at schools and kindergartens, deliberately turning such facilities into military targets. The White House says it will support any move by Finland and NATO to join NATO in a reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki told reporters that the U.S. would support a NATO application by Finland and or Sweden should they apply. Moscow warned Finland yesterday that it would face consequences as it seeks to apply for NATO membership without delay. In response, Psaki said NATO is a defensive alliance and there is no aggressive intent in considering Sweden or Finland for membership.
Well, first, let me say that the United States would support a NATO application by Finland and or Sweden should they choose to apply. We, of course, will respect whatever decision they make. Both Finland and Sweden are close and valued defense partners of the United States and of NATO. I would note that even without them being members of NATO, our militaries have worked together for many years. We're confident that we can find ways to work with them, address any concerns either country may have about the period now or whatever is required if they were to join NATO. I would say in terms of how this benefits the American people, I think is sort of what you're asking about. Having a strong NATO alliance, a strong Western alliance, which is a defensive alliance, by the way, is good for our security around the world. And certainly having a strong partnership with a range of countries, including Sweden and Finland, if they decide to join, should be reassuring to the American people about our own security interests. NATO is a defensive alliance. It's not an offensive alliance. Both Finland and Sweden are close and valued defense partners of the United States and NATO. They're thriving democracies. They've worked closely with NATO for years. There's no aggressive intent from NATO, from the United States, from Finland or Sweden, obviously they can speak for themselves, to Russia. But again, this is President Putin who caused this. Look at the mirror. And I think that also probably is the reason for what you've seen as public support for joining NATO increase in these countries as well.
Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin is said to be responsible for Finland's policy shift as it moves to join NATO. That's also according to a European lawmaker from the country. Finland's president and prime minister had said earlier yesterday that the country must apply to join the military alliance without delay in a departure from previous policy triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Moscow said the move was definitely a threat and warned it was ready to respond. But Finland's neighbor, Sweden, is also close to a decision on asking to join NATO after decades of following a neutral path.
I would say that everything changed 24th of February when Russia attacked full-fledged to Ukraine. Finland, as a neighboring country to Russia, what Russia does is an important thing to us. And this attack was something which is totally impossible to understand or to accept. And it means that every neighbor of Russia must think and rethink their position in this situation. So NATO membership decision is a very rational thing to do after 24th of February. I would say that there is not an acute threat from Russia's side, but we have to take into account that what happened in Russia towards Ukraine is possible also towards other neighboring countries. You have to take this into account. And this means that when the security situation has changed, we have to change also our security and the defense policy lines.
You know, I have also changed my opinion on the question. I was not a supporter of the NATO membership before, but of course during the last months I have changed my opinion because I'm in the Foreign Affairs Committee and Security Committee, and after the intel we started receiving basically during the last autumn already that Vladimir Putin has gathered some troops on the border of Ukraine, I started estimating that something horrible might happen. And of course for Finland this is definitely an implication that we cannot trust the international law and order. We cannot trust that Putin respects those. So this made me change my position. And I know that many people are very hesitant about whether Finland can actually promote our values of peace and human rights inside NATO. But I think that we can do it better in the table rather than outside of the whole door.
Let's talk now to retired diplomat Ambassador Obole Amedu Ode, who joins us virtually. Your Excellency, thank you for your time this morning. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me on your program. Good morning.
Let's begin with what we've just been hearing now. Russia says it will respond if Sweden and or Finland join NATO. But there are those who I've spoken to who have said that that threat may not be easy to carry out because that would mean that the Russian forces would now be stretched on 3 or 4 fronts and that that might actually make it possible to defeat them. But why do you think strategically at this time now Finland and Finland and Sweden are in Russia's crosshairs, given what is going on in Ukraine?
Well, simply put, I guess like the Finnish leader just said in the clip that has just been played, that their thinking is that if Russia can invade Ukraine, then it is highly likely, highly probable that they can invade any other neighboring country, including Finland and other Scandinavian countries. So basically, for me, it's a fear factor.
In that case, let's talk now about other things that have been fairly quiet in most of the analysis and most of the talking heads that we have seen during the course of this crisis since February 24th. There's something called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, which for many people it will be one of the quiet elephants in the room because quite a number of those who have interest in this matter are members of that organization, including China and Russia. What role do you see that organization playing at this point? And if so, how?
So far, there hasn't been any overt role by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which came into being in 2001 with headquarters in Shanghai. Right now, it has a membership of 8 countries, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, and 4 other Commonwealth of Independent States as members. Their role so far has been rather benign, though they have a military and defense pact and as a clause in their agreement. But beyond that, also they are a political, economic alliance. Generally, it's been seen within academic and diplomatic circles as the Eastern Alliance. However, competing and competitive national interest has not made this Shanghai Cooperation Organization to be as vibrant as we have in NATO. Not yet.
Given that scenario, there's something else. At the start of this conflict, there were certain doctrines that were mentioned by some of the participants. That we had the Monroe Doctrine, which several people referenced in identifying and explaining why Russia felt that this action was necessary at the time. And then we now have the Wolfowitz Doctrine. For those who do not recollect, Mr. Wolfowitz, of course, was a former president of the World Bank, but in another life, shall we say, he was also a U.S. Deputy Defense Secretary. Can you expatiate on this doctrine and what it has to do with this current conflict?
Yeah, the Wolfowitz Doctrine came into being. That is the informal name, but the formal title for that document is the Defense Policy Guidance. It came into being in 1991 after the breakup of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And basically, what is outlined in the doctrine was the agenda to have, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, to have the United States as the sole superpower, a unipolar world where the United States is in command and in control, even as a benign or benevolent hegemon, but remains there, and that all other countries should not be encouraged one way or the other of challenging that dominant role of the United States.
Given that situation, quite a number of people think that, of course, I've heard the analysis being said that China, which references the Shanghai Cooperation Organization you mentioned earlier on, and Russia were not particularly in this way when the Wolfowitz Doctrine was put in place, that defense policy was put in place, that both countries now are much stronger and that they, in fact, refer to themselves or regard themselves as hegemons too, particularly China, which is also in a much stronger position than it was in 1991, both militarily and economically. Do you see China playing a much bigger role down the line in this conflict?
Yeah, for obvious reasons, I do not see China coming out overtly in playing a role in support, one way or the other, of Russia's outing in Ukraine. Having said that, though, the doctrine itself, the Wolfowitz doctrine, is one that espouses the hegemonic role the United States should and must and continue to play in world affairs. Now, over the decades, Russia, to some extent, has relatively, comparatively recovered from the collapse of the Soviet Union and have been able to put its acts together. Also, on the Chinese side, there has been a spike. In fact, there's a book I have read which said The Peaceful Rise of China. And that has led to China wanting to, or being urged by other countries, to play a much more frontal role in global affairs. Now, when you put that together and under the purview of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, vis-a-vis NATO, the picture that emerges, the picture that I am seeing, is a picture of the fact that the issue at stake now is an ideological opposition where one side, the NATO group led by the United States, pursue a unipolar world, and as opposed to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, because if you read through their statements, their outcome papers during their summits, they are pursuing a policy of a multipolar world. So to me, this is where the two differences, the difference in opinion of what the global affairs should be run, comes into play.
Before I let you go, I must then ask possibly what the logical follow-up of this is. That means an institution or an entity like the United Nations, because of what you have just analyzed, at the level of the Security Council, cannot, especially when its members are involved, reach any kind of consensus for action in a situation like this. Because of the 5 members, you've got Russia and China on one side, you've got America, Britain, and France on the other side. And so once this is ideological, then there's no way out of it. There's no way reason can prevail, is there?
Yeah, the fact of that, all of them, the 5 members whom you just mentioned, 2 on the eastern side and 3 on the western side, all wield the veto power. So normally anything that comes into that will lead to a deadlock. But deadlock, as it may be, can always be resolved by negotiation. And eventually they'll have to get to the negotiating table to iron out their differences and find common grounds on which they can move the world forward, away from belligerency and kinetic display of power.
We'll have to wait and see how all of this turns out. This is we're getting into week 12 of this conflict. Very few people would have predicted it would have lasted this long. But Ambassador Bole Amedo, thank you so much for your time this morning and for your perspective on the program.
Thank you for having me. Have a good morning.
And you too. After the break, Russian energy experts accuse the United States of being ultimate beneficiary from EU sanctions on Russian energy. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. The United Nations Human Rights Chief says that 1,000 bodies had been recovered in the area of the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, in recent weeks, adding that many of the violations it is verifying since the Russian invasion may amount to war crimes. The Human Rights Council will decide whether to task investigators with an official probe into the events that occurred in Kiev and other regions in February and March. Russia denies targeting civilians and calls its actions in Ukraine since February the 24th a special military operation to disarm the country and rid it of what the Kremlin calls anti-Russian nationalism fomented by the West. Ukraine and the West say Russia launched an unprovoked war of aggression. Meanwhile, Ukraine has accused Russian forces of being responsible for, quote, the most gruesome human rights violations on the European continent in decades. A resolution brought by Ukraine and supported by more than 50 other countries would mandate a newly formed commission of inquiry to investigate events in the regions around Kiev that were temporarily held by Russian troops. A spokesman for the Russian mission to the United Nations in Geneva did not provide an immediate comment on the possibility of a war crimes investigation.
The areas of Kyiv, Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv regions, which have been under Russian occupation in late February and March, have experienced the most gruesome human rights violations on the European continent in decades. Dozens of cities have been leveled to the ground, others have become unsuitable to live in. Over 500,000 of our citizens forcibly deported to the Russian territory with their whereabouts unknown. Torture and enforced disappearances, sexual and gender-based violence, the list of Russia's crimes is endless.
Ukraine says it will not accept an alternative to EU membership. That's according to its foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, who was speaking in response to a proposal by French President Emmanuel Macron in Berlin. Mr. Macron had said on Monday that in his proposal for a new political European community that it would help structure Europe's security architecture, which had been shattered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
I heard what President Macron said in his address, but I literally lack details to make my final conclusion in it. But I can tell you right away that no alternatives to European integration of Ukraine will be acceptable. This, we firmly believe that it will be in the best interests of Europe to grant Ukraine EU candidacy status in late June at the summit of the European Council. And then discussions on the further strategic development of Europe and how it should be structured can continue. It will take time. I don't think Germany perfectly understands where this discussion will bring everyone to. So this is an open discussion, but EU candidacy status must be granted.
The State Emergency Service of Ukraine has released footage, it says, shows 2 schools destroyed by shelling in Chernihiv. The footage showed smoke rising from the unnamed boarding schools in Novograd-Zhevsky, which were left with shattered windows and collapsed walls. Charred vehicles, trees, and debris littered the school grounds in the footage posted to the Emergency Services Facebook page. The service says 3 people were killed and 12 were left wounded in the shelling. In the meantime, a fire resulting from the shelling destroyed structural elements in a 280 square meter area, causing extensive damage to the schools. Let's speak to Onyekachi Adekoya. He's the Chief Executive Officer of PR24 Risk Management Consulting. Joins me here in the studio. Good morning.
Good morning.
As I was talking to the last guest, I was saying that at the start of this, very few people would have predicted that this would go on for the 12th week now. What's been your reading of the situation?
Yeah, I think it's been a long time coming, since 2014. If you'd been following the trends in Ukraine, a lot of Western interest and covert operations started in the Ukraine to prepare them for what the intelligence community had assessed would be an eventual Russian onslaught. So the U.S. intelligence got it right, and the U.S. military support in getting the Ukrainian military prepared for that onslaught was quite spot on. So I'm not sure what happened on the side of Russia, but the anticipation of the moves and maneuver of Russia was quite anticipated well in advance. and they had dug in the fences and defensive system around Kyiv and other parts of Ukraine. So to say it's dragged out for this long, I think it was a bit anticipated that Russia was not going to have its way freely. But nobody expected the whole situation to unravel the way it did, which then forced Russia to a strategic maneuver towards the east. So I think that what's playing out, let's say it's been anticipated, but not the events on ground, the way it's unfolding.
You're a risk management expert. And therefore, I mean, all of this, I mean, once you come to conflict, it's about risk.
Absolutely.
And we've already started seeing the fallout of possibly not taking all into consideration. So many people now are talking about the possibilities that we're going to have food insecurity worldwide because those two countries involved are bread baskets. We've already seen the spike in energy prices, which people are feeling in the household budget, both in terms of fueling. Even here in Nigeria, we've seen it in the aviation industry, which would have shut down last weekend as a result of. Would you say that elsewhere, I mean, outside the theater of operations, those who ought to prepare the individual countries that could have been the ones who were to bear the fallout of this, did the assessment properly?
No, I wouldn't think so. I think that there's been a gross miscalculation on every side, really, on the part of the Russians, on the part of the West. And interestingly, we're seeing for the first time where a situation where sanctions are backfiring on the West. If you look at the US, for example, new expenditure or loans on housing has dropped by 70%. New procurement of brand new cars has dropped by over 90%. Households are having to adjust to inflation and inflationary pressures. People are beginning to spend more on commodity items, on food items, which explains why Netflix lost almost 300 billion thereabouts in value. So we're seeing a decline in expenditure in the services sector, but we're seeing an uptick in expenditure in the commodity sector. And what's driving that commodity expenditure is food. Just yesterday, I think 2 days ago, there's been a major scarcity in feed formula for certain level of infants in the US. It has hit Canada now. In the UK, true inflation in the UK, true inflation, not the stated inflation by government, true inflation is about 15-16%. True inflation in the US is much higher. The Fed has raised rates, has to raise rates by another 50 basis points again.
And it has had minimal effect, even with all these raises, because the business correspondent was here, our business correspondent was here, and I was saying, okay, since the last raise date, has it come down?
No, but there's still more issues. So they have to raise the rates higher. If inflation stated is at 8%, for you to combat inflation effectively, you need to raise rates to about 9-10%, which the Fed cannot do. So the US is bound for a major economic crisis, and some analysts set this to crystallize around 2025. So even the US going into a major economic crisis will pull the UK in, will pull the world. If you look at the crisis, Russia, China, and India account for total global commodities export of about 40%. So what we have done in estimating the size of economy is we've estimated the size of the US, the Western economy, because that sector, the economy was bloated by services.
Right.
But real manufacturing and commodities is ruled by the East. So you are having supply chain disruptions in the East. China, I suspect their lockdown is too strict. And it's not a coincidence that it's coinciding with the Russian-Ukraine crisis, further exacerbating the supply chain disruption. And the world has not seen the true state of the disruption yet, because a lot of the manufacturing sectors are feeding off reserve stock and emergency stock. Okay, so there's going to be shortage of palladium, of nickel, of neon, a lot of base metals. Vehicles are piling up in Germany. They are not being exported. Russia has always been a very big market. So the near-term prognosis for the world is quite bleak. And in terms of risk, I don't think both sides will have to, like the last speaker said, would have to come back to the negotiating table, because NATO has to save face, and Russia cannot lose this war. Practically, it's a nuclear-powered state, and poking the Russian bear by the side, it won't blow anybody any good wind. So Finland, interestingly, wants to join NATO. Finland gets over 60 to 70% of its energy requirement from Russia. So if they start a conflict now, the people that will suffer are the people on the ground. So the politicians, if you look at Macron's case, he's used practically the Russian-Ukraine crisis to tide over the elections with Marine Le Pen.
Right.
It was going against him very bad. You can say the same thing of Joe Biden. You can say the same thing of the UK Prime Minister. So on the one hand, you have this bolster and talk from the elites, the politicians and the political class. But the real situation on the ground is biting. There are protests now in France, and the fear is that if inflation continues to spike and household continues to feel the pinch in their pocket, you will begin to sense some resentment in the West against the ongoing crisis.
Right.
And both parties cannot afford a long, drawn-out situation. That's the risk assessment, on a global scale and the impact for Nigeria. I mean, we could spend the whole day talking about that.
Yeah, but we do have to talk about that,
Absolutely.
even if we don't spend the whole day, because I referenced that in the question I asked you when I talked about, the impact we're already seeing. I mean,
Yes.
we import a lot. We import a lot of things. And these countries that are involved in this conflict are many of the importers. I mean, if you take wheat, you take some of the other grains that you already referenced earlier on, petroleum products, energy prices, and all of that. If we are not yet feeling the full weight of it in Nigeria, perhaps it's the explanation you gave about reserve stocks and all of that. But those will soon run out.
Yes.
So what do you then see?
Well, we are headed for a major problem, really, because I think an assessment was done of the Nigerian economy over a 4-year period from 2020 going backward. And what we're seeing is that Nigeria had spent over 4 trillion naira on importing food. Our import bill rose last year by 140 billion naira. Okay, and if you look at the bread basket of the nation, that's about the North Central. The North Central is awash with crisis. We now have reports of ISWAP in Kogi, in Kwara, in Taraba, where
Which were hitherto fairly quiet places.
Over the last decade, they've not been fairly quiet. They've been having skirmishes around Plateau, Benue, those major food baskets. Kaduna has now snowballed into another situation. Now, in the tip of the North Central to Northwest, we had livestock farming, some wheat, grain production, and the rest coming down. Now, headache farmer crisis is also exacerbating the food situation in Nigeria. Food inflation has gone up by 88%. The financial derivatives did a bit of an analysis on that. So what we're seeing is that the insecurity situation that is affecting herders and farmers is causing prices to rise. Our importation is also increasing because of this crisis. At the same time, where we're importing from, they are also suffering supply chain disruptions. We're also importing more inflation. So Nigeria is in a precarious situation, as it were. We can't meet our food security needs. We are having to import inflation and its associated costs into the country. What that means is that the disposable income of households in Nigeria is currently under some significant pressure, but that pressure is only likely to increase. So there's a big problem up ahead if you ask what's the implication for Nigeria. The other greater implication is that if we look at how the war has panned out in Ukraine and how that Ukraine is holding off Russia, don't think it's just only Ukraine. Of course, there are some elements within Ukraine also supporting the Ukrainian army. Nigeria doesn't have enough capacity to defend itself forward. Our defense capacity is not what it should be. Our offense capacity is not even anywhere near it should be. So we don't have the sufficient tooling and requirements to address our insecurity issues, which will not help us address the food security issues, and which would then lead us to a bigger problem even as we run up into 2023. So definitely there's a knock-on effect and impact on Nigeria. And apart from this crisis, because the Fed has to tighten money supply,
right,
the increase in rates on the side of the Fed is going to also affect our cost of repayment of our loans. We are heavily geared as a country. I'm not sure, but I saw a report that was suggesting that we're spending almost 70% of our revenue servicing debts. I'm not sure how that is true and correct.
The figures that sometimes we get are higher than that.
Absolutely. Some argue 90, but right. I want to err on the side of caution.
Okay.
Because if you say 90, then that's you're setting out an alarm bell outside there. So there's a huge impact on Nigeria, on the world, and we've not seen it all, because you have India, China on one side. Russia got kicked out of SWIFT. Now Russia has its own switching platform with China. They want to integrate with Iran, China, India to create like a bit of a hegemony on the side. You heard the last speaker talk about a unipolar world, a multipolar world,
right.
And these whole arguments of ideology. We've not seen the end of it. And unfortunately, the crisis of ideology has not peaked. It has not reached its climax yet. So some analysts in Bloomberg and some other Oxford Economics, for example, are anticipating a major global shift anytime around 2025 to 2030. So this thing we see in Russia and Ukraine, yes, is ideological, both sides cannot lose, may spiral out of control, and you have NATO, a nuclear force, and Russia, a nuclear powerhouse. It's not true that China would not get involved. You see, there's China on the one hand, shaping towards Taipei. China's asked its financial institutions to stress test against any future sanction by the US, yes, suggesting that a move is possible. So there's a lot of geopolitical shifts going on. And I do hope that every side will come together for the sake of global peace and come to the negotiating table, okay? But the problems and the prognoses are not looking very good.
Of course, our own situation, before I let you go, I must talk about our own situation, is also complicated by the fact that this also happens to be election season. Absolutely. When even with everything else held equal, we neglect every other thing and focus on the politics. Now, with what you've just said, there are so many other things we ought to be focusing on, even as we prepared for the politics. Again, it comes back to the issue of managing the risks that have come out. And we were always a risky endeavor. Now we've become even more risky. So, I mean, taking a look ahead now, if you were to identify, say, two things that, along with what we're doing politically, which is inevitable, what must the policyholders be looking at to do to mitigate the worst of the outcomes you have identified?
Sadly, it's too late to start preparing now because in risk management, you have to anticipate risk. So if the policyholders have not clearly anticipated the risk that we face as a nation, it's too late to do that because the risk is already at foot. That brings us to a risk register. Do we have a risk register as a country to understand our full exposures and what we should be doing to mitigate those? So we are not there yet. Unfortunately, like you said, we are now in a political season. We are seeing a flurry of resignation from ministers. We have a president who is not particularly disposed to macroeconomic discussions or sound macroeconomic advice. His chief economic advisor, Dr. Doyin Salami, is a sound economist and a sound person. I'm not sure how much of the advice he's getting is using. So we like quick fix in Nigeria. Unfortunately, there is no quick fix to whatever it is we have on ground. The best we can hope is that the new administration comes in and hits the ground running. Because if I talk about the defense sector, it's too late to begin to talk about certain things. There has to be a holistic redraw of the national security posture, not architecture, national security posture and doctrine to address these issues. Understanding that in the near term, 20 to 10 years, or say 2050, for example, Nigeria is projected to outgrow the US. The land that we currently have, 937,000 square kilometers of land, is fixed, but population is expanding. Before we used to have rural-urban drifts. Now we're having urban to rural drifts. That layered now with the header farmer crisis, land is becoming very scarce. There is desertification. World Economic Outlook also estimates that the risk of climate change inaction would also have its own impact on food security. Nigeria is currently rated as country number 95 in the Global Food Security Index, over 107 countries assessed. So where do we start from if the current crop of political elites that we have are not in the depth of thinking of the risk that we face, are not prone to those discussions, are not even disposed to it, and all we are faced with now is politicking. So there's a bit of a problem ahead. But, you know, as we say in Nigeria, we're quite aspirational, we're quite hopeful, and we're hoping that tomorrow will be better, but there's a lot of problem ahead. I just want to leave it at that.
Thank you so very much. Oyekachi Adekoya, thank you for your perspective and for your time this morning on the program. After the break, Ukraine hope for an emotional Eurovision win, saying any victory would be important. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. A Russian expert, Stanislav Petrakovich, says the United States will be the ultimate beneficiary from the European Union imposing sanctions against imports of Russian energy. Mr. Petrovich, a leading expert with the National Energy Security Fund and a lecturer at the Financial University of the Government of the Russian Federation, pointed out that Europe's global competitive advantages in manufacturing industries would become weak following the energy embargo on Russia. He said out of concern for unnecessary pressure on their own economic growth, the EU may be forced to delay the full implementation of the embargo while embracing the hope that the Ukraine crisis could be resolved in the next few months so that they could also dispel their worries. But there are still a lot of uncertainties on how things could play out. Let's talk to Laddie Williams from our business desk. Laddie, good morning. The ruble has jumped up to meet 2017 levels.
Yeah, not looking like a rubble.
Yeah, but what's fueling this time?
Well, we saw how, you know, when the sanctions, you know, hit, we saw how the ruble sank to about 133 rubles to a dollar. You know, but we've seen the Russians actually take, you know, a couple of strict measures. We saw how they, you know, increased their interest rates, and they also, you know, made sure that exporters, you know, in the country convert their proceeds, about 80% of that, you know, into the ruble. So, you know, analysts believe these, you know, measures are they're quite temporary with the impact, you know, they're getting. But we've seen, you know, solid impact, you know, in the short term, you know, with all of these moves, you know, used to strengthen the ruble. We've seen how they've also pegged the ruble to a gold, you know, with their massive reserves. So they pegged, you know, an ounce of gold to about 5,000 rubles. So they're buying all of that gold directly from, you know, their merchants there, which is also, you know, propping up the ruble. Quite, you know, interesting moves, but they're actually working. And at this point, there's less demand for foreign exchange because they're not really importing as they should because of the sanctions also. Yeah, so all of this is helping push up the ruble and, you know, give it strength against the euro and the dollar.
The World Bank is saying that Ukraine is going to benefit from record remittances this year.
Yes,
no surprises
up about 20%. Yeah, no surprises. We're seeing how, you know, Ukrainians abroad, they're projecting that Ukrainians abroad, you know, at this point, the country is suffering. There's war, and a lot of people there need support. So Ukrainians abroad are going to be sending a lot of money home, you know, to help their families that are in Ukraine. So the World Bank has looked at it and said, you know what, with all of this happening, the projection is that remittances will go up. But it's not the same for Central Asian countries because those countries get most of their remittances from Russia. Right. And we're seeing, you know, Russia's not going to be sending out most money. So it's a different, you know, situation, you know, for those countries. But the World Bank is saying, you know, Ukraine is going to get more remittances, going to pop up this year, you know, because of what the war that's happening in Ukraine.
Oil prices, that hairy old chestnut again.
Yes.
They're on track for a weekly loss. They started up.
Yeah, even though it's up this morning, but with the disruptions to, you know, Russian oil, and, you know, the EU, you know, ramping up the process of, you know, weaning off Russian oil. But, you know, they still have the issue with Hungary. You know, Hungary is not joining, you know, because they are heavily reliant on Russian gas. We see the EU is divided when it comes to, you know, winning off Russian gas at this point. It's not easy. They rely heavily on it.
And they've made it clear that
they've got nothing.
You know,
that
to replace it with
Exactly.
if they give it up.
Exactly. So we're seeing all of this, play into the oil market, even though natural gas still going up, because obviously once there's a disruption with natural gas supply, the prices will go up. And we're seeing the same thing happen with oil. It's a seesaw movement in that market. There's also demand issues with the largest importer of oil, China, having they have the COVID issues. So all of that, demand issues, supply disruption issues, all pulling and pushing the market at this point. That's why we're seeing so much volatility in the oil market, as also playing into risky assets. We've seen heavy sell-offs with equities markets with the U.S. We've seen NASDAQ plunge to levels not seen in many years.
One of my guests was referencing Netflix.
Netflix, exactly. And now we're seeing that play into the crypto market too. We've seen Bitcoin plunge to levels not seen since last year, July. This morning, it's trading about that $31,000, but it's falling as low as $27,000. So it's not an easy time for most investors, risk asset investors. But at the end of the day, there might be a chance that inflation might be peaking in the U.S., but still remains to be seen. We're going to check out how, but we'll see how energy prices are playing into all of that.
Thank you, Ladi. There'll be more of that, of course, on Business Morning and Business Incorporated. Thank you for your time this morning. Let's take a look at the sports news with reference to the war in Ukraine. Rafael Nadal says it is the job of the ATP Players Council to defend Russian and Belarusian players who have been banned from this year's Wimbledon but refuse to confirm reports that they have asked for the tournament's ranking points to be taken away. The All England Lawn Tennis Club barred players from the two countries from competing in response to what Russia calls a special military operation in Ukraine. The decision has been condemned by both the men and women's tours as well as several other players.
There are some private conversations on the council about this kind of stuff, something that I think it's not good to go public. The only thing that we can do is be in touch with Wimbledon and with the rest of the ATP management to do the things that works better to protect every single player in the ATP. That's at the end, that's our job, to protect the players and to work in the benefit of every single player that we are representing. That's all. The rest of the things I am not able to talk about it. My personal opinion, I gonna say it, and I already say it in private, but it's about the tour.
Gyms have started to reopen in Ukraine, among them the All Stars Boxing Club in downtown Kiev, where boxers have been flocking to release pent-up stress in the Ukrainian capital. The trainers have been putting boxing enthusiasts, fitness fanatics, and newcomers through their paces, jumping ropes, doing crunches, and sparring. One of the gym's frequent visitors, Alexander, says it serves as an emotional relief in such difficult times. Ukraine has maintained a dominant presence in the boxing world, with Kiev's mayor Vitaly Klitschko alongside his brother Vladimir being former world champions. Alexander Osiek is currently the unified heavyweight champion of the world. And finally, on the program, Ukraine's Kalush Orchestra looks set to ride a wave of public sympathy to win the Eurovision Song Contest when performers take to the stage in the Italian city of Turin on Saturday, May the 14th. Kalush Orchestra's entry, Stefania, sung in Ukrainian, fuses rap with traditional folk music and is a tribute to frontman Oleg Pusik's mother. The bookmakers have made it clear that it is the favorite for the annual contest, which draws a television audience of close to 200 million based on the plight of Ukraine following Russia's invasion. The band, however, takes its name from the western Ukrainian city of Kalush. And And that's our program this morning. Thanks for being with us. I'm Ladi Akeredoluale. There's an update at 5 o'clock. Please watch out for that. But for now, do go ourselves. Have a good Friday and a pleasant weekend ahead.